close on a boy standing at the edge of a gravel parking lot in the flat, gray light of early March, holding a wrinkled $5 bill in his left hand and a backpack containing everything he owns slung over his right shoulder. Behind him, the rusted skeleton of an industrial park that stopped being industrial 2 decades ago. In front of him, a county auction tent with folding tables and a portable speaker system that crackles every time the wind shifts. His name is Daniel Moran. He is 18 years old. He has been homeless for 11 days, and in approximately 40 minutes he is going to spend his last $5 on something that every adult in this tent will tell him is worthless, an abandoned municipal water tower on the edge of a town that has mostly forgotten it exists, sealed shut since 1968, resting in a field behind a defunct railroad spur in Harlan County, Kentucky. Nobody in that tent will understand why he wants it. Nobody will try to stop him because nobody cares enough to intervene in the decisions of a teenager they have already written off. But what none of them know, what Daniel himself cannot possibly imagine as he stands in that gravel lot with his $5 bill and his too light backpack and the quiet, stubborn expression of someone who has run out of options but not out of will, is that sealed inside the base of that water tower, behind a hatch that has not been opened in over 55 years, is something so extraordinary, so historically significant, and so financially staggering that it will rewrite the story of Harlan County itself and hand Daniel Moran a future that every person who ever dismissed him, abandoned him, or looked through him as though he were made of glass will be forced to witness with their own eyes. Stay with me until the very end, because what he found when he finally pried open that rusted hatch will prove to you that the things this world throws away, including its children, sometimes carry the most extraordinary power of all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Moran was not supposed to end up here. That is the thing worth understanding first, before the auction and the water tower and everything that came after, that Daniel Moran had been a child with a home and a family and a future that looked, from the outside at least, like it was going to work. He grew up in Harlan, Kentucky, a town of roughly 1,500 people nestled in the southeastern corner of the state where the Appalachian Mountains press close and the economy has been contracting steadily since the coal industry began its long, slow retreat decades ago. Harlan is the kind of town where people know each other's names and each other's business and each other's family histories going back 3 or 4 generations, the kind of town where leaving is common and staying is either a choice or a circumstance, depending on who you ask. Daniel's mother, Sharon Moran, had been a stay. She had grown up in Harlan, married young, had Daniel at 22, and settled into the particular rhythm of small-town Appalachian life with the quiet determination of a woman who believed that steadiness was its own kind of ambition. She worked at the Harlan County Public Library for 14 years, a job she loved with the genuine, uncomplicated devotion of someone who had found the one thing she was meant to do. She shelved books and ran the children's reading program and knew every regular patron by name and by preference and by the particular way they held a book when they were truly lost in it. Daniel had grown up in that library almost as much as he had grown up in their small house on Clover Hill Road. He had done his homework at the table near the back windows while his mother worked the circulation desk. He had read everything he could reach and then everything he couldn't reach once he was tall enough to use the step stool without asking. By the time he was 12, he had read more books than most adults in Harlan had read in their entire lives, and he had developed the particular kind of quiet intelligence that comes not from formal instruction but from the accumulated weight of thousands of hours spent inside other people's ideas. His mother had noticed. She had encouraged it without making a production of it, the way good parents encourage things, by simply making space for it to grow. She bought him a used laptop when he turned 13. She drove him to the community college in Middlesboro once a month so he could sit in on open lectures in history and environmental science. She told him, not often but at the moments when it mattered, that he was going to do something extraordinary, and she said it with the kind of calm certainty that made him believe it even on the days when believing anything felt difficult. Then Sharon got sick. It started with fatigue that wouldn't lift and a cough that lingered through the winter and into the spring. She went to the clinic in Harlan twice before they referred her to the regional hospital in Middlesboro, and the regional hospital sent her to Lexington, and Lexington told her what the clinic and the regional hospital had been circling around without quite saying. Stage 3 lung cancer. She had never smoked a cigarette in her life. She was 39 years old. The treatment lasted 14 months. Daniel was 15 when it started and 16 when it ended, and in the space between those two ages he became someone fundamentally different from the boy who had sat at the library table reading about the history of Appalachian water systems and dreaming vaguely of college. He became a caretaker. He cooked meals when his mother couldn't stand long enough to use the stove. He drove her to appointments in Lexington in the old sedan that she had taught him to drive in the library parking lot on Sunday mornings. He managed the insurance paperwork that arrived in thick envelopes with language designed to be understood by no one. He held her hand in waiting rooms and hospital corridors and on the long drives home through the mountains when neither of them had the energy to speak but neither of them wanted to be alone with the silence either. Sharon Moran died on a Wednesday in April, 2 weeks before Daniel's 17th birthday. The funeral was small and attended by people who had genuinely loved her, library patrons and neighbors and the women from her church group who had brought food to the house every week during the treatment without ever being asked. Daniel stood beside the grave in a suit that didn't quite fit anymore because he had grown 3 inches in the past year without anyone noticing, and he listened to people say things about his mother that were true and kind and completely insufficient to capture what she had actually been. What happened after the funeral was the part that broke something in Daniel that had not been broken by grief alone. Sharon had no savings. The medical bills had consumed everything, the small life insurance policy, the modest retirement account from the library, the equity in the house on Clover Hill Road. What remained after the debts were settled was less than nothing. The house went to the bank. The car went to a creditor Daniel hadn't known existed. The furniture, the books, his mother's careful collection of library science journals that she had kept on the shelf above her desk, all of it was claimed or sold or simply left behind when Daniel locked the front door for the last time and walked away with a backpack and a phone with 12% battery and no clear idea of where he was going to sleep that night. He had no father. His father, a man named Rick Moran, had left when Daniel was 3 years old and had maintained exactly 0 contact in the 14 years since. Daniel knew almost nothing about him beyond what his mother had told him in careful, measured fragments, that Rick had been charming and unreliable and had decided, when Daniel was still young enough to be carried, that the weight of a family was more than he was willing to bear. Sharon had never spoken about him with bitterness. She had spoken about him with the particular exhaustion of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by disappointment. Daniel had an uncle, his mother's older brother, a man named Carl Lester, who lived in a double-wide on the south side of Harlan with his wife Donna and their 2 teenage sons. Carl had attended the funeral. He had shaken Daniel's hand and told him that Sharon had been a good woman and that if Daniel ever needed anything he should call. Daniel had called. 3 days after the funeral, standing in the parking lot of a gas station with his backpack and his dying phone and nowhere to go, he had called Carl and asked if he could stay for a while, just until he figured out his next step, just until he turned 18 and could apply for work and maybe find a room somewhere. Carl had said yes. Donna had said yes. The 2 cousins, Tyler and Brett, had said nothing, which Daniel interpreted as neutral and later understood as the silence of people who had already decided he was temporary. He moved into the back room of the double-wide, a space that had been used for storage and was cleared just enough to fit a mattress on the floor. He was grateful. He said thank you every day for the first 2 weeks. He cleaned the kitchen without being asked. He mowed the lawn. He applied for jobs at every business in Harlan that had a help wanted sign, which was not many, and at several that didn't, which was none. The arrangement lasted 5 months. It ended on a Tuesday evening in February, 11 days before the auction, when Carl sat Daniel down at the kitchen table with an expression that was not unkind but was unmistakably final. Carl explained that the double-wide was too small for 5 people. That Tyler needed the back room for his weightlifting equipment. That Donna's mother was going to be staying with them starting next month and they needed to make space. That Daniel was almost 18 now, practically an adult, and it was time for him to stand on his own feet the way young men were supposed to. Carl handed him an envelope containing $200 in cash and told him it was the best he could do. He said he hoped Daniel understood. He said family was family but space was space, and sometimes the two things didn't fit together the way you wanted them to. He said all of this with the practiced sincerity of a man who had rehearsed the speech enough times to believe his own reasons. Daniel took the envelope, packed his backpack, and walked out of the double-wide into the cold February dark without saying anything that he would later regret, which was itself a kind of discipline that most 17-year-olds would not have been capable of. He walked to the gas station on Route 38 and sat on the curb under the fluorescent lights and counted the money twice. $200. Plus the $17 he already had in his pocket. $217 total, and in 9 days he would turn 18, which meant he would age out of the limited protections that existed for minors in the state of Kentucky and become, in the eyes of every system designed to help people like him, someone else's problem, which in practice meant no one's problem at all. He spent the next 11 days in the controlled, methodical survival mode that people enter when the margin between managing and not managing is measured in single dollars. He slept 2 nights in the back of an unlocked storage shed behind a hardware store on Main Street. He slept 3 nights at the Harlan County Community Center, which had a warming station program that operated from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. during the winter months. He spent 4 nights in the public library after hours, a fact he was not proud of but which he accomplished by hiding in the basement utility closet before closing and letting himself out through the emergency exit at dawn. He ate carefully, rationing his money with the precision of someone who understood that every dollar spent on food was a dollar that could not be spent on whatever came next. He turned 18 on a Saturday. Nobody noticed. He did not celebrate. He bought a coffee from the gas station and sat in the parking lot and allowed himself exactly 5 minutes of feeling sorry for himself before he shut it down and started thinking about what to do with the $195 he had left. That was the morning he saw the flyer. It was taped to the bulletin board inside the gas station, a single sheet of paper printed in black ink on yellow stock, the kind of thing that community organizations post and nobody reads. Harlan County Surplus Property Auction. Saturday, March 8, Harlan County Fairgrounds, Tempe seized, surplus, and abandoned properties. All sales final. Opening bid start at $5. $5. Daniel read the flyer twice. He photographed it with his phone. He walked to the library and used the public computer to look up the auction listing on the county website. The list was short, 7 properties, mostly vacant lots and condemned structures with opening bids ranging from $5 to $2,000. At the bottom of the list, the last entry, was the one that made him stop scrolling. Lot 7. Abandoned municipal water tower. Steel and concrete construction, circa 1952. Located on 0.8 acres, unincorporated land off County Road 12, adjacent to defunct LNN Railroad Spur. Tower decommissioned 1967. Access hatch sealed by county order, 1968. Property classified as structural liability. Significant remediation concerns. Opening bid, $5. There was a single photograph attached to the listing, grainy and clearly taken from a distance. It showed a cylindrical steel water tower, maybe 60 feet tall, standing alone in a field of dead grass and scrub brush. The tower's legs were latticed steel, rusted to a deep brown. The tank at the top was a wide, flat-bottomed cylinder with riveted seams and a domed cap. At the base, where the legs met a concrete foundation pad, Daniel could just make out what appeared to be a steel door, small and square, set into the concrete. A hatch. Sealed since 1968, he stared at the photograph for a long time. He thought about the $195 in his pocket and the fact that he had no home and no family willing to keep him and no plan beyond the next 48 hours. He thought about his mother and the way she had always told him that extraordinary things sometimes lived inside the places that nobody else bothered to look. He thought about the fact that $5 for a piece of land, even worthless land, was $5 for something that was his. Something with a door. Something that might, if nothing else, keep the rain off his head for a night or two until he figured out what came next. He closed the browser, left the library, and spent the rest of the week waiting for Saturday. The Harlan County Fairgrounds on auction morning had the atmosphere of a place that existed for purposes exactly like this, functional, unadorned, populated by people who knew the drill and had already decided what they were there to buy. Tent B was a large canvas structure set up on the gravel lot behind the main exhibition hall, furnished with metal folding chairs and a podium where a county clerk named Harold Bevins stood organizing paperwork with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had conducted these auctions quarterly for the past 15 years. Daniel arrived early. He took a seat near the back, his backpack wedged between his feet, and watched the room fill. Maybe 30 people, mostly men, mostly middle-aged, mostly carrying the particular confidence of repeat attendees who viewed these auctions as routine business rather than momentous occasions. He recognized a few faces from around Harlan. Ray Combs was there, a heavy-set man in a Carhartt jacket who owned a string of rental properties on the east side and was known around town for buying distressed lots, sitting on them until the market shifted, and selling at a markup that the original owners would have wept over. His son, Kevin Combs, sat beside him, mid-20s, with the polished, self-satisfied air of a young man who had inherited confidence without earning it. Near the front, a woman Daniel didn't recognize was reviewing the property list with a highlighter and a legal pad, the organized energy of a professional investor. Harold Bevins opened the auction at 10 o'clock sharp. He worked through the lots in order, his voice carrying the flat, practiced cadence of someone reading a script he could recite in his sleep. A vacant residential lot on the north side went for $800 to Ray Combs, who raised his hand without looking up from his phone. A condemned single-story commercial building sold for $1,200 to the woman with the legal pad. A strip of undeveloped hillside land generated a brief exchange between two bidders before settling at $2,400. Daniel waited. His hands were in his lap. The $5 bill was in his right front pocket, folded into a tight square the way his mother used to fold money before putting it in the church offering plate, neat and deliberate and treated with respect regardless of the amount. When Bevins reached Lot 7, the room's energy shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. A few people glanced at each other. Ray Combs leaned over to Kevin and said something that made Kevin smirk. The woman with the legal pad turned the page without marking anything. Lot 7, Bevins announced, reading from his sheet. Abandoned municipal water tower, steel and concrete, circa 1952, on 0.8 acres off County Road 12. Tower decommissioned 1967. Access hatch sealed by County Order 1968. Structural liability classification. Significant remediation concerns. Sold strictly as is. Opening bid is $5. He said it the way a person says something they are required to say but do not expect anyone to take seriously. $5. The lowest possible opening bid the county would allow, the financial equivalent of asking someone to take a problem off your hands for the cost of a fast food meal. Silence. Ray Combs shook his head slowly, the gesture of a man who had calculated the demolition costs and remediation liability in his head before Bevins had finished speaking and found the math decisively unfavorable. Kevin was looking at his phone. The woman with the legal pad had already moved on to reviewing something else entirely. $5, Bevins repeated. Anybody? Daniel raised his hand. Every head in the tent turned. Not quickly, not dramatically, just the slow, collective rotation of a room full of adults registering that a teenager in a worn jacket with a backpack between his feet had just bid on a condemned water tower. $5, Bevins said, looking at Daniel over the top of his reading glasses with an expression that was equal parts surprise and something Daniel would later identify as reluctant compassion. Son, you understand this is as is? No inspection, no warranties, the county takes no responsibility for anything on or in that property. I understand, Daniel said. $5. Bevins looked around the tent. Anyone want to counter? $5 for 0.8 acres and a decommissioned water tower. Nobody moved. Ray Combs turned to Kevin and said, just loud enough for the rows nearby to hear, "Kid just bought himself a tetanus shot." Kevin laughed. A few others smiled. The woman with the legal pad didn't look up. "Going once," Bevins said. "Going twice." He paused, then shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Sold to the young man in the back for $5. See the clerk after we finish." Daniel stood when the auction ended and walked to the clerk's table at the side of the tent. He unfolded the $5 bill and placed it on the table with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that this particular piece of paper represented not just currency but a decision, the kind of decision that either looks brilliant or insane depending entirely on what happens next. The clerk, a woman named Janet who had been processing these transactions for years, looked at the bill and then looked at Daniel and then processed the paperwork with the professional neutrality of someone who had learned not to editorialize. She handed him a deed, a property survey map, and a rusted key on a county evidence tag. The key was heavy, flat-headed steel, about 3 inches long, and it had the particular weight of something that had not been touched in a very long time. Daniel put the key in his pocket, the deed in his backpack, and walked out of the tent into the pale March light with $190 remaining in the world and a piece of land that every person in that room had already decided was nothing. The walk to County Road 12 took an hour and 40 minutes from the fairgrounds. Daniel could have hitched a ride, probably, but he didn't try. He wanted the walk. He needed the time between the auction and the arrival, the space to think about what he had done and what he was about to see and what he would do when he got there. The road surface deteriorated steadily as he left the town proper, paved streets giving way to cracked asphalt and then to gravel and then to a dirt track that wound through bare winter woods along the ridgeline above the valley. County Road 12 was the kind of road that existed on maps but barely existed in practice. It had been built to service the LNN railroad spur that had once connected the coal operations on the eastern ridge to the main line running through Harlan, but the spur had been abandoned in the 1970s and the road had been left to deteriorate with it. The trees pressed close on either side, leafless and gray, their branches interlocking overhead like the ribs of something enormous and long dead. Daniel followed the property survey map on his phone until the GPS signal weakened and then failed entirely, and after that he navigated by landmarks, the rusted remains of a railroad crossing sign, a collapsed wooden gate, a creek bed that the survey map indicated ran along the southern boundary of the parcel. When he rounded the last bend in the track and stepped through a gap in a wire fence that had mostly surrendered to gravity and rust, he stopped walking and looked at what he now owned. The water tower stood alone in a field of dead grass and low brush, rising 60 feet into the gray sky with the particular authority of a structure that had been built to last longer than the purpose it was built for. The legs were latticed steel, 4 of them, set in a square pattern on a concrete foundation pad approximately 20 feet across. The tank at the top was a wide cylinder, maybe 30 feet in diameter, with riveted seams and a domed cap. The steel had oxidized to a deep, uneven brown, streaked in places with pale mineral deposits where rainwater had traced its paths over decades. A narrow maintenance ladder ran up the outside of one leg to a catwalk that encircled the tank. The catwalk railing was partially collapsed on the eastern side. And at the base, set into the concrete foundation pad at ground level, was the hatch. It was a steel door, approximately 3 feet square, with a heavy lever handle and a locking mechanism that looked like it had been designed for a submarine rather than a municipal utility structure. The edges of the hatch were sealed with what appeared to be a thick bead of industrial caulking that had hardened and cracked over the decades but had not fully failed. Someone had sealed this hatch with deliberate, thorough intention. They had not merely closed it. They had closed it and made sure it stayed closed. Daniel crouched in front of the hatch and examined it for a long time. The county evidence tag on his key matched a stamped number on the locking mechanism. He could see tool marks around the edges where someone, probably a county worker, had applied the sealant. He could see a small brass plate, green with age, mounted on the concrete beside the hatch. He wiped it with his sleeve and read the stamped text. Harlan County Municipal Water Authority. Tower 7. Commissioned 1952. Decommissioned 1967. Access restricted by county order, April 1968. Authorized personnel only. Authorized personnel. Daniel looked at the deed in his backpack and the key in his pocket and the brass plate on the concrete and thought about the fact that he was now, technically, the only authorized personnel this property had. The county had sold it. The county had washed its hands of it. Whatever was behind this hatch was his to find or his to leave sealed, and nobody in the world cared which choice he made. He tried the key. It slid into the lock with resistance, the mechanism stiff and corroded but not frozen. He applied pressure, steady and increasing, and felt the internal components engage reluctantly, like a joint that hadn't been moved in decades, remembering that it was designed to move. The lock turned with a sound that was less a click and more a grinding exhalation, metal against metal, rust against rust, time against itself. The hatch did not open easily. The sealant held along the edges, cracked but tenacious, and Daniel had to work his fingers into the gap and pull with his full weight before the seal broke with a sound like tape being torn from cardboard, sudden and final and somehow louder than it should have been in the quiet of that empty field. The hatch swung open. Cold air rose from below, dry and still and carrying a smell that Daniel had not expected, not decay, not rot, not the damp exhale of a flooded basement, but something clean and mineral, like the inside of a cave, like stone and metal and preserved time. He leaned over the opening and shined his phone light down. A steel ladder descended into darkness. The rungs were discolored but intact. The walls were concrete, smooth and solid. The light reached maybe 15 feet before the space opened into something wider, something Daniel could not see clearly from above. He sat at the edge of the hatch for a full minute, thinking. He was 18. He was alone. He was homeless. Nobody knew he was here. If the ladder broke or the space collapsed or something went wrong, nobody would come looking for him. He understood these facts clearly and without self-pity, the way he had learned to understand most facts about his situation over the past year, as conditions to be managed rather than reasons to stop moving. He put his phone between his teeth, gripped the top rung of the ladder, and descended. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The ladder held. Every rung protested with a thin metallic complaint but bore his weight without failure. At the bottom, approximately 15 feet below ground level, Daniel stepped onto solid concrete and took his phone from his mouth and swept the light in a slow arc around the space he had entered. He did not move for a long time. The base of the water tower was not what he had expected. He had imagined a simple utility chamber, maybe a small room housing pipe connections and valve controls, the kind of municipal infrastructure space that existed to be functional and nothing else. What he was standing in was something entirely different. The chamber was circular, following the footprint of the tower above, roughly 20 feet in diameter. The walls were poured concrete, thick and smooth, and they extended upward to a ceiling that was the underside of the tower's main tank structure. But the chamber was not a single room. Along the curved walls, 3 heavy steel doors were set at equal intervals, each one closed, each one fitted with a lever handle identical to the one on the hatch above. The doors were painted the same military olive drab that Daniel had seen on surplus equipment at the Army-Navy store in Harlan, the particular shade that the federal government had used for everything from filing cabinets to aircraft carriers during the Cold War. In the center of the chamber, bolted to the concrete floor, was a metal desk. On the desk sat a typewriter, an olive drab rotary telephone with its cord coiled neatly beside it, and a stack of file folders held together with a large binder clip. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but the dust was even and undisturbed, the kind that accumulates slowly in a sealed space where air does not circulate and nothing moves. Nothing had been touched in here since the hatch was sealed. Daniel could feel that certainty in his bones, the way you can feel the age of a place when you stand inside it and let the silence speak. He approached the desk and looked at the file folders without touching them. The top folder was labeled in typewritten text on a standard government label. Project Wellspring. Harlan County Water Authority. Classification, Municipal Confidential. 1962 to 1968. Daniel set his backpack on the concrete floor, pulled up the only chair in the room, a heavy metal office chair with cracked vinyl upholstery, and sat down at a desk that had been waiting for someone to sit at it for over 55 years. He opened the first folder and began to read. What he found in the next 3 hours, sitting in that cold circular chamber beneath a water tower that no one in Harlan County had thought about in decades, would change not only his life but the lives of nearly everyone in the county who had ever turned on a faucet, paid a water bill, or trusted the local government to tell them the truth about what was flowing through their pipes and beneath their land. But Daniel did not know that yet. Not fully. Not in the way he would come to know it over the weeks and months that followed. In that moment, in the dust and the silence and the cold mineral air of a sealed room beneath a forgotten tower, he was simply a homeless 18-year-old boy reading documents that a dead man had left behind, and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, that he had found something that mattered. The first folder contained 47 pages of typed correspondence between the Harlan County Water Authority and the United States Geological Survey, dated between March 1962 and November 1963. The letters were formal and precise, written in the particular bureaucratic language of mid-century government communication where every sentence seemed to carry the weight of an institution behind it. Daniel read slowly, carefully, the way his mother had taught him to read things that mattered, not skimming for the main idea but absorbing every line, every detail, every implication that lived between the words. The correspondence described a project. Project Wellspring had been a joint initiative between the federal government and the Harlan County Water Authority to conduct a comprehensive geological survey of the underground water resources beneath the eastern ridge of Harlan County. The survey had been authorized in 1961 under a federal clean water infrastructure program that provided funding and technical expertise to rural Appalachian communities whose water systems were aging and whose populations were growing, or were expected to grow, as the coal industry expanded. The USGS had sent a team of hydrogeologists to Harlan County in the spring of 1962. They had spent 18 months drilling test wells, analyzing core samples, mapping underground water flows, and compiling what the correspondence repeatedly referred to as the most comprehensive subsurface hydrological survey ever conducted in southeastern Kentucky. What they had found was extraordinary. Beneath the eastern ridge of Harlan County, beginning at a depth of approximately 280 feet and extending downward through multiple layers of limestone and sandstone, lay an aquifer of a scale that the survey team's lead geologist, a man named Dr. Franklin Ware, had described in his summary report as regionally unprecedented. The aquifer spanned an estimated 14 square miles beneath the county's eastern and northern sectors. Its water capacity, based on core sample analysis and flow rate testing, was sufficient to supply clean drinking water to the entire county and several neighboring counties for what the report conservatively estimated as 200 years at projected consumption rates. The water quality was exceptional, naturally filtered through limestone strata that removed contaminants and produced water that met or exceeded every federal standard without any treatment whatsoever. Daniel read Dr. Ware's summary 3 times. The language was technical but the implications were clear even to someone without a geology degree. Harlan County was sitting on top of one of the largest untapped freshwater reserves in the entire Appalachian region, and the federal government had known about it since 1963. The second folder answered the question that had begun forming in Daniel's mind before he finished the first. If the government had known about this aquifer for over 55 years, why had nobody in Harlan County ever heard of it? Why was the town still drawing its water from an aging surface reservoir system that was perpetually underfunded and periodically contaminated by agricultural runoff and, in recent years, by chemical byproducts from the coal processing operations on the northern ridge? The second folder contained the answer, and the answer made Daniel's hands go cold. In January 1964, 3 months after Dr. Ware's survey was completed and his findings submitted to both the USGS and the Harlan County Water Authority, a meeting had taken place in the office of the county water commissioner, a man named Virgil Combs. Daniel paused at the name. Combs. He thought of Ray Combs in the auction tent that morning, the heavy-set man in the Carhartt jacket who had called his purchase a tetanus shot. He thought of Kevin Combs beside him with his polished smirk. He kept reading. The meeting's attendees were listed on a typed memorandum marked internal only, distribution restricted. Present were Virgil Combs, the county water commissioner. Harold Elkins, representing the Harlan County Board of Supervisors. Thomas Crane, identified as legal counsel for Eastern Ridge Coal Company. And a man named Martin Blackwell, whose title was listed as Regional Development Coordinator for Appalachian Resource Holdings, a corporate name that Daniel did not recognize but whose presence in the room alongside a coal company attorney told him everything he needed to know about the nature of the meeting. The memorandum was 4 pages long. Daniel read every word. The substance of the meeting was this. Dr. Ware's aquifer survey had identified the underground water reserve with precision. It had also identified something else, something that the USGS team had noted in their geological analysis but had not fully explored because it fell outside the scope of their hydrological mandate. The limestone and sandstone strata that contained the aquifer also contained significant deposits of high-grade metallurgical coal, the kind used in steel production, accessible through the same eastern ridge formations that the coal companies had been mining from the surface for decades but had not yet reached at depth. The aquifer and the coal occupied the same geological space. Extracting one would compromise the other. Deep mining operations through the aquifers containing strata would fracture the limestone, contaminate the water, and potentially drain the aquifer entirely. Conversely, developing the aquifer for municipal water supply would require establishing protected zones around the underground reserve that would make deep coal extraction in the eastern ridge legally and practically impossible. The meeting's conclusion was documented in a single paragraph at the bottom of the 4th page, written in Virgil Combs's handwriting rather than typed, as though the official record could not quite bring itself to contain what had been decided. The paragraph read, "It is the consensus of all parties present that the Ware survey findings represent a significant complication to ongoing and planned extraction operations in the Eastern Ridge sector. It is agreed that the survey data will be retained at the Tower 7 facility pending further review and that no public disclosure of the aquifer findings will be made at this time. The Water Authority will continue to operate under existing surface reservoir protocols. Federal reporting requirements will be satisfied through the submission of an amended summary indicating inconclusive results." Daniel read the paragraph a 4th time. Then he set the folder down on the desk and sat very still in the cold air of the sealed chamber and felt something building in his chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief but something between the two, something that recognized what he was looking at with a clarity that surprised him. They had buried it. The county water commissioner, the board of supervisors, the coal company, and whoever Appalachian Resource Holdings represented, they had taken a federal survey proving that Harlan County had access to 200 years of clean drinking water and they had sealed it in a room beneath a water tower and lied to the federal government about the results. They had done it to protect coal extraction rights. They had done it in 1964. And for 55 years, the people of Harlan County had been drinking substandard water from an aging reservoir system while a pristine underground reserve sat 280 feet beneath their homes, untouched and unacknowledged. The 3rd folder contained the personal papers of the man who had tried to stop it. Dr. Franklin Ware had not accepted the suppression quietly. His papers included copies of 3 formal letters of protest sent to the USGS regional office in Reston, Virginia, each one detailing the irregularities in the amended summary submitted by the Harlan County Water Authority, each one requesting that the original survey data be reviewed and the aquifer findings restored to the public record. The first letter was dated February 1964. The second was dated June 1964. The third was dated January 1965, and it was the last. Attached to the third letter was a handwritten note on USGS letterhead, not from Ware but from his immediate supervisor, a man named Douglas Hale. The note was brief and devastating. "Frank, I've done what I can. The regional office is not going to revisit this. The political pressure from the Kentucky delegation is considerable. I'm sorry. You need to let this go." But Ware had not let it go. Not entirely. The 4th and final document in his personal file was a letter addressed to no one, written in longhand on plain paper, dated March 1968, 1 month before the county sealed the hatch on Tower 7 and condemned the property. If you are reading this, you have found the room that should never have been sealed. I am leaving these documents here because every other channel I have tried has been closed to me. The county has made the survey disappear from their records. The USGS has accepted the amended summary and moved on. The coal companies are expanding their operations on the eastern ridge, and no one is asking questions about what lies beneath the coal because no one knows there is anything to ask about. I am an old scientist with no political power and no allies in positions of authority. But the data is the data. The aquifer is real. It is one of the most significant freshwater reserves I have encountered in 30 years of geological survey work, and the people of this county deserve to know it exists. I am leaving everything here because concrete and steel do not lie and they do not forget. Whoever you are, whenever you find this, the truth is in these folders. Use it well. Franklin Ware, Ph.D., United States Geological Survey, retired. Daniel folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder. Then he opened the 3 steel doors set into the curved walls of the chamber. The first door opened onto a room approximately 8 feet deep, lined with metal shelving. On the shelves, arranged with the meticulous organization of a man who understood that evidence only mattered if it could be found and verified, were the original core samples from the 1962 survey. Dozens of cylindrical rock samples, each one labeled with a depth reading, a location coordinate, and a date, sealed in clear tubes and stored upright in wooden racks. The samples were intact, preserved in the dry, temperature-stable environment of the sealed chamber exactly as Ware had left them. The second door opened onto a smaller room containing the survey equipment itself, instruments Daniel recognized from the geology textbooks he had read in the library, a portable seismograph, a water quality testing kit in a heavy metal case, a set of well logging tools mounted on a wooden frame. Everything was vintage, everything was functional looking, and everything carried the institutional markings of the United States Geological Survey. The third door was different from the others. It was heavier, reinforced with a steel crossbar, and fitted with a second lock in addition to the lever handle. The key from the county evidence tag did not fit this lock. Daniel examined it for several minutes before noticing a small metal box welded to the underside of the desk, positioned where a seated person's knees would be. He reached under and opened it. Inside was a second key, smaller than the first, and a folded note in Ware's handwriting. For the finder. This room contains the legal documents. They are more important than the survey data because the survey can be replicated but the legal framework cannot. Read everything before you act. FW. Daniel unlocked the third door. Inside, mounted on the wall in a sealed glass frame, was a document that made him sit down on the concrete floor because his legs stopped being entirely reliable. It was a federal water rights charter, issued by the United States Department of the Interior, Bureau of Land Management, dated September 1963. The charter established perpetual access and development rights to the subsurface aquifer identified by USGS Survey 62 HK 1141 beneath the eastern and northern sectors of Harlan County, Kentucky. The rights were vested, in accordance with the Federal Water Resources Development Act of 1958, in the owner of the surface facility designated as the primary monitoring and access point for the aquifer system, which was identified in the charter as Harlan County Municipal Water Tower No. 7. The charter was unambiguous. Whoever owned Tower 7 held the legal right to develop, manage, and profit from the aquifer beneath 14 square miles of Harlan County. The right was federal, not county. It existed outside the jurisdiction of the local government that had conspired to suppress it. And it had been sitting in this room, behind a locked door, inside a sealed chamber, waiting for someone to find it for over half a century. On the shelf below the framed charter were 4 binders containing the supporting documentation, federal registration numbers, BLM filing receipts, correspondence between Ware and the Department of the Interior confirming the charter's validity, a certified copy of the original survey findings bearing the USGS official seal, and a detailed legal analysis, apparently commissioned by Ware at his own expense, explaining exactly how the charter could be activated and enforced by any future owner of the Tower 7 property. Daniel spent 2 days in the chamber. He did not leave for 48 hours except to walk to the gas station 3 miles back toward town to charge his phone and buy water and a package of crackers. He photographed every document, every page of every folder, every core sample label, every piece of correspondence. He read Ware's legal analysis twice, then a third time, making notes on the back of the property survey map with a pencil he found in the desk drawer. He slept on the concrete floor with his backpack as a pillow and his jacket zipped to his chin and the cold, dry air of Dr. Ware's careful legacy settling around him like the silence of a library after closing. On the morning of the third day, he climbed out of the hatch, sat on the concrete pad in the early spring light, and called the only person he could think of who might help him understand what to do with what he had found. Margaret Boone taught history at the Harlan County Middle School and ran a free legal clinic out of her apartment on Thursday evenings. She was 58, sharp-featured, and possessed of the particular kind of intelligence that comes from spending decades in a community and paying attention to things that other people preferred not to notice. Daniel had met her twice, both times at the library when he was younger, and his mother had spoken of her with the quiet respect that Sharon reserved for people who were genuinely good and genuinely unafraid to be inconvenient. He called. She answered on the second ring. He told her who he was, that he was Sharon Moran's son, and that he had found something under the old water tower on County Road 12 that he needed someone to look at. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you get to my apartment by 3 o'clock?" And Daniel said he could and she said, "Bring everything." He spread the photographs and the documents across Margaret Boone's kitchen table at 3:15 that afternoon. She examined each item in sequence, the way a person examines evidence rather than information, with attention to provenance and context and the relationship between each piece and the next. She made 3 phone calls, 2 to contacts at the University of Kentucky's College of Law and 1 to a former colleague at the Kentucky Department for Environmental Protection. She spent 40 minutes on her computer verifying the federal registration numbers from the Water Rights Charter against the Bureau of Land Management's online database. When she turned back to Daniel, her expression had the careful neutrality of someone who is trying not to show that they are astonished and not entirely succeeding. "Daniel," she said, "do you understand what you have?" "I think I do," he said, "but I want you to tell me." "You have a federal water rights charter that gives you legal authority over the largest untapped freshwater aquifer in southeastern Kentucky. You have original USGS survey data proving the aquifer exists, backed by core samples that can be independently verified. You have documentary evidence that the Harlan County Water Authority conspired with coal interests to suppress the survey findings and file a fraudulent report with the federal government. And you have the legal analysis confirming that the charter transfers with the property deed." She paused. "You own the water rights. Not the county. Not the coal companies. You. What happens when we make this public?" Daniel asked. Margaret leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling the way people do when they are running calculations that involve more variables than they are entirely comfortable with. "The county government will contest it. The coal companies will fight it with everything they have because the protected zones around the aquifer will shut down their deep mining expansion plans on the eastern ridge. Ray Combs and every developer who is built on that corridor will push back because the land values shift fundamentally when there is a federal water resource underneath them." She looked at him. "You will be going up against every powerful interest in Harlan County simultaneously. Can we win?" Margaret picked up the federal charter and held it in both hands as though feeling its weight. Dr. Ware was a meticulous scientist. "The documentation is extraordinary. The federal registration exists entirely outside the county's ability to interfere with it, which is exactly why Ware filed it in Washington rather than locally. And the suppression itself, the amended summary, the internal memo documenting the cover-up, that is not just a property rights issue. That is a federal fraud case. The county submitted falsified findings to a federal agency." She set the charter down. "Yes. I believe we can win. But you need a real lawyer, not a middle school teacher with a Thursday night clinic. You need someone who handles federal property and environmental law. And you need to move carefully because the moment you file, the pressure will come from every direction at once. I'm 18 years old, Daniel said. I'm homeless. I own a water tower I paid $5 for. I don't have money for a lawyer. Margaret looked at him for a long moment with an expression that reminded him, with a sharpness that caught in his throat, of the way his mother used to look at him when she was about to say something she wanted him to remember. Daniel, your mother was one of the best people I ever knew. She would have been very proud of what you just did, not the finding, but the reading. You sat in a dark room for 2 days and read every page. Most people would have stopped at the money. You read until you understood the injustice. She picked up her phone. I know someone. A water rights attorney in Lexington named Paul Harden. He's good, he's honest, and he has a history of taking cases on contingency. When the cause is right. Let me make the call. Paul Harden drove from Lexington to Harlan the following day. He was 44, tall, with the lean energy of a man who ran marathons and the focused attention of someone who had spent 2 decades in courtrooms where the details mattered more than the drama. He sat at Margaret's kitchen table for 3 hours reviewing the documents. He asked Daniel precise questions about the chain of custody, how the key had been obtained, whether the hatch seal had been intact, whether Daniel had observed any signs of prior unauthorized entry. Daniel answered each one clearly and in order. At the end of the review, Harden closed the last folder and looked at Daniel with an expression that was professionally contained but visibly affected. This is one of the most consequential property rights cases I've seen in this state in 20 years, he said. The federal charter alone is worth pursuing, but combined with the suppression evidence, this isn't just a quiet title claim. This is a fraud disclosure. The county will be defending not just their claim to the water rights but their liability for 55 years of concealment. What's the aquifer worth? Daniel asked. Harden was quiet for a moment. In terms of water supply infrastructure development, municipal licensing, and long-term resource management contracts? Conservatively, based on comparable aquifer valuations in the region and the projected development value of a 14-square-mile freshwater reserve of this quality? He paused. We're talking about something in the range of $80 to $120 million in development potential over the next 30 years. And that's before you account for the environmental remediation claims against the coal operations that have been mining above the aquifer without disclosure for decades. The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret was watching Daniel's face. Harden was watching Daniel's hands, which were resting on the table, perfectly still. Daniel did not move for several seconds. When he spoke, his voice was steady in a way that surprised even him. Dr. Ware waited 55 years for someone to open that hatch, he said. He left everything in that room because he believed that the truth about that water belonged to the people of this county, not to the coal companies and not to the politicians who buried it. Whatever we do with this, it has to honor that. The water belongs to Harlan County. The rights belong to me, legally, but the water belongs to the people who live here. Harden looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Daniel. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and in that moment Daniel felt something shift in the room, the particular quality of silence that occurs when adults recalibrate their assessment of a person they had been prepared to underestimate. I'll take the case on contingency, Harden said. Pro bono if it comes to that. Let's file. Paul Harden filed the federal quiet title claim and the accompanying fraud disclosure with the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Kentucky on a Monday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon Harlan County had become a very different place than it had been 24 hours earlier. The filing appeared in the public record before noon. By 1:30, an attorney representing Eastern Ridge Coal Company had flagged it. By 3 o'clock, Ray Combs had called 4 people, none of whom gave him the answers he wanted. By the following morning, a regional reporter for the Lexington Herald-Leader who monitored federal environmental filings had published a story that traveled considerably further and faster than anyone in Harlan County was prepared for. The headline was straightforward and devastating. Homeless teen's $5 water tower purchase uncovers 55-year cover-up of massive aquifer beneath Harlan County. The story was picked up nationally within 48 hours. Not as a legal story first but as a human interest story, which was precisely the framing that made it most dangerous to the people it implicated, because it made the public sympathetic to Daniel before the legal arguments had even been fully heard. A boy with nothing. A sealed hatch. A dead scientist's careful truth. The narrative wrote itself, and it wrote itself in Daniel's favor with a momentum that no public relations firm could have manufactured or countered. Ray Combs held a press conference outside his property management office on Thursday. He stood behind a folding table with his son Kevin beside him and two attorneys flanking them like bookends and delivered a statement that described the claim as baseless, the documents as unverified, and Daniel Moran as a troubled young man exploiting public sympathy for personal gain. He used the phrase without legal merit twice and the word frivolous 3 times and smiled for the cameras with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire adult life being the largest presence in every room he entered. Daniel watched the clip on his phone that evening sitting on the concrete pad beside the open hatch of Tower 7. He watched Ray Combs dismiss him with the same casual confidence with which Ray's grandfather Virgil had dismissed Dr. Ware's findings 55 years earlier, and he felt something settle in his chest that was not anger but recognition. The same machinery. The same dismissal. The same assumption that power and volume could substitute for truth. The Combs family had been burying inconvenient facts in Harlan County for 3 generations, and they were trying to bury this one the same way, by making the person who found it seem small enough to ignore. Daniel put his phone away, looked up at the water tower rising above him into the darkening Kentucky sky, and thought about Dr. Franklin Ware sitting in this same spot 55 years ago, writing a letter to someone he would never meet, trusting the concrete and the steel and the simple durability of documented truth to outlast the people who wanted it gone. Ware had been right. The concrete had held. The steel had held. The documents had survived every year of silence the county had imposed on them, and now they were in the public record where no county commissioner and no coal company attorney could make them disappear again. 3 weeks after the filing, Federal District Judge Anita Reeves in Lexington denied the coal company's motion to dismiss. Her ruling was 38 pages long and methodical and entirely favorable to Daniel's position. She noted that the Bureau of Land Management registration was unambiguous, that the Federal Water Rights Charter was properly recorded and legally binding, and that the original USGS core samples, which Paul Hardin had arranged to have independently tested by a geological laboratory at the University of Kentucky, confirmed Dr. Ware's findings in their entirety. The aquifer was real, it was vast, and the federal charter vesting its development rights in the owner of Tower 7 was valid. The ruling was not a final judgment on ownership, but it was a signal that every attorney involved read the same way. They were going to lose if this went to trial. The settlement negotiations began the following week. Eastern Ridge Coal Company, Ray Combs's property holding group, and the Harlan County government, which faced its own liability for the 1964 suppression, entered discussions through their respective legal teams. The opening offer was $3 million. Daniel declined without hesitation. The second offer, delivered after Judge Reeves scheduled a trial date, was $9 million. Daniel declined again. Paul Hardin called him after the second rejection. "They're going to come back higher," he said. "What's your number?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. He was sitting at Dr. Ware's desk in the sealed chamber, the same desk where a scientist had typed his protests and filed his evidence and waited for a response that never came. "I want 3 things," Daniel said. "First, fair compensation for the water rights, and fair means based on the actual valuation, not on what they think they can get a homeless kid to accept. Second, the aquifer gets developed for municipal water supply. Harlan County gets clean water from its own underground reserve. That was the whole point of Ware's survey. That's what he wanted. Third, a public acknowledgement. The county admits the suppression. Ware's name goes on the public record as the scientist who found the aquifer and tried to report it. His original survey findings get restored to the federal record with his name on them. The public acknowledgement will be the hardest one for them to agree to," Hardin said. "It opens the door to additional liability." "Then they should have thought about that in 1964, Daniel said. The final settlement was reached 6 weeks later, after Judge Reeves denied a second procedural motion by the coal company and scheduled depositions that would have required the current county water commissioner to testify under oath about what his office had known and when. The terms were these. Daniel received $14.2 million in compensation for the transfer of development rights to a newly established Harlan County Water Trust, a public entity that would manage the aquifer's development for municipal supply. He retained full ownership of Tower 7 and the surrounding 0.8 acres. The county published a formal acknowledgement in the Harlan County Register and submitted a corrected report to the USGS restoring Dr. Ware's original survey findings to the federal record with full attribution. Eastern Ridge Coal Company agreed to fund an independent environmental assessment of their mining operations above the aquifer zone and to comply with whatever remediation requirements the assessment produced. The acknowledgement ran in the Harlan County Register on a Friday. Dr. Franklin Ware, Ph.D., United States Geological Survey, had conducted a comprehensive hydrological survey of Harlan County in 1962 and 1963. His findings, documenting a major freshwater aquifer beneath the county's eastern and northern sectors, had been suppressed through a coordinated effort by county officials and private interests. The record was corrected. The truth, sealed for 55 years in a concrete chamber beneath a water tower that nobody wanted, was officially on the surface. Daniel signed the settlement paperwork on a Monday. After Hardin's contingency fee, taxes, and the immediate expenses of someone who had been living on crackers and gas station coffee for weeks, Daniel had just over $10 million. He sat in Hardin's office in Lexington and looked at the number on the bank confirmation and did not feel what he expected to feel. He did not feel triumph or vindication or the sudden weightless relief of someone whose problems have been solved by money. What he felt was something quieter and harder to name, something that had to do with his mother and with Dr. Ware and with the sealed hatch on a water tower in a field that the whole world had looked at and seen nothing. He drove back to Harlan that evening. He went to the cemetery where Sharon Moran was buried under a simple stone that he had not been able to afford to engrave beyond her name and her dates. He sat in the grass beside the stone in the late afternoon light and told her what had happened, all of it, from the auction to the hatch to the documents to the settlement, and he told her that she had been right, that extraordinary things did live inside the places nobody else bothered to look, and that he had found one because she had taught him how to read carefully and think patiently and keep going when keeping going felt impossible. He stayed until the light was gone. Then he drove to County Road 12 and sat on the concrete pad beside Tower 7 and watched the stars come out over the eastern ridge, the same stars that Dr. Ware must have watched on the nights when he came out here alone to maintain his archive and tend his stubborn, quiet faith that someone would eventually find what he had left behind. Ray Combs did not speak to Daniel directly after the settlement. He did not need to. The settlement itself said everything that needed to be said, and the look on Ray's face at the county register office when the acknowledgement was published, the particular expression of a man watching the foundation of his family's influence crack along a fault line that had been there for 3 generations, was its own kind of statement. Kevin Combs left Harlan 2 months later. He moved to Lexington and took a job with a development firm that had no connection to his father's business. Whether that was growth or retreat Daniel did not particularly care to determine. He had moved entirely beyond the orbit of the Combs family's opinion of him, and that distance, earned and permanent, was one of the quieter satisfactions. Carl Lester called once. He left a voicemail that Daniel listened to and then deleted. Carl said he was glad things had worked out, that family was family, that he had always believed Daniel would land on his feet. Daniel recognized the particular tone of a man rewriting his own history in real time, reclassifying an eviction as encouragement, and he found he had no interest in participating in the revision. He did not call back. He did not need to. The Ware Foundation opened 6 months after the settlement. Daniel converted the base chamber of Tower 7 into a small but functional office and education center, preserving Dr. Ware's original desk and the 3 rooms exactly as they had been found. The core samples remained on their shelves. The survey equipment stayed in its room. The federal water rights charter hung on the wall in its original glass frame, cleaned and properly lit. A bronze plaque was mounted beside it, simple and direct. Dr. Franklin Ware, 1921 to 1986. He found the water. They buried the truth. He sealed it in concrete and trusted the future to find it. This foundation exists because he was right. The foundation's mandate was specific. Scholarships for young people in Harlan County pursuing degrees in environmental science, geology, and water. Resource management. Emergency housing assistance for displaced youth in the county. And a community archive project documenting the history of Appalachian water systems and the communities that depended on them, the kind of quiet, essential infrastructure work that Dr. Ware had devoted his career to and that most people never thought about until the day they turned on the faucet and nothing came out. Margaret Boone became the foundation's first board member. She brought the same sharp attention and steady patience that she brought to everything and told Daniel, on the day the foundation opened, that his mother would have insisted on shelving the archive materials herself. The Harlan County Water Trust broke ground on the first aquifer access well the following spring. When clean water from Dr. Ware's aquifer flowed through a Harlan County tap for the first time, Daniel was standing in the basement chamber of Tower 7 reading a passage from Ware's original survey report to a group of middle school students who had come on a field trip to learn about where their water came from. He paused when the news reached him by text from Margaret, looked at the students sitting on folding chairs in the room where truth had waited for 55 years to be heard, and said, "It just got here." On the first anniversary of the auction, Daniel sat on the concrete pad above the hatch in the early morning before anyone else arrived. The water tower rose above him against a sky that was pale and clean and very quiet. He held the rusted key in his hand, the same flat-headed steel key that the county clerk had handed him on an evidence tag, and he thought about the boy who had stood in a gravel parking lot with a $5 bill and a backpack containing everything he owned and raised his hand for something that every adult in the room had already decided was worthless. $5. A sealed hatch. A dead scientist's careful truth. He had learned something in the past year that he had not known before, or perhaps had known but had never felt in his bones the way he felt it now. That the things the world discards are not always worthless. That the people the world overlooks are not always without purpose. That truth, properly preserved and honestly pursued, has a durability that outlasts the people who try to bury it and the systems they build to keep it buried. Dr. Ware had known that. He had sealed his evidence in concrete and steel and trusted the future to send someone patient enough to read it. Daniel's mother had known it too, in her own way. She had raised a boy in a library and taught him that the most important things in the world were usually found between the pages that nobody else had bothered to open. The foundation's door opened at 9. The first appointment of the day was a 17-year-old girl from the south side of Harlan who had been living in her car for 3 weeks and had heard that there was a place on County Road 12 where someone might help her figure out what came next. Daniel met her at the door, showed her inside, poured her a coffee, and sat across from her at Dr. Ware's desk in the room where everything had changed. He kept the $5 bill framed on the wall behind the desk. Below it, a small card in his own handwriting read, "The best doors are the ones nobody else wanted to open." Daniel Moran was going to spend the rest of his life making sure other doors stayed open for the people who needed them most. That seemed like the right use of a legacy found beneath a water tower that the whole county had laughed at, built by a scientist who believed truth was worth preserving even when the world told him it wasn't, and opened by a boy who had nothing left except the stubborn, quiet conviction that nothing was not the same as the end. He picked up his coffee and got to work. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. Stories like this one remind us that the most important doors haven't been opened yet. If this moved you, there are more stories waiting for you on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I don't want you to miss what's coming. See you in the next story.